Hello, everyone. We are now concluding lesson 30 with lecture 3, where we are looking at the aftermath of Tiberius's death. So here we are on the family tree. Tiberius died in 37, and although some of our sources reported that he may not have died a natural death, nevertheless, it seems largely that he did, although in an interesting move, his first heir, Caligula, did not have him divinized. So unlike Augustus, who became a god, a divine figure upon death, Tiberius did not. And part of the reason was that the young man who became the heir, Caligula, was in fact the son of Germanicus, who you might recall was killed under Tiberius. And in general, it seemed that Caligula showed limited interest in honoring the memory of Tiberius, who was very much disliked during his long absence from Rome. Now, Caligula is actually a nickname for Gaius Caesar, and it's he was named after this little tiny leather sandal thing that typically soldiers wore in the Roman Empire. And he got this name because when his father Germanicus was fighting, he would take his son and his family along with him, and supposedly the soldiers dressed Caligula up in this mini soldier outfit, and he got the nickname, and that was that. So Caligula took power in 37, and very soon after he took power, and it might be helpful to follow this along on the handout, he fell ill, and many of our sources report that he was different after he recovered. And, you know, we can speculate all we want about whether he thought somebody may have had an influence in his illness, but more importantly, he comes across as a much more autocratic emperor after he recovers. Some of these things included in the following year that he got rid of the Praetorian prefect, who actually helped him to power. It included some sort of strange plans, including a number of issues related to his sisters. And if you look at this coin of Caligula, you can see that he had 3 sisters. And the ancient sources tell us a lot about how supposedly he had inappropriate sexual relations with them. And I think a good way of thinking about all these talk is that one of the ways that the ancient Romans would speak about their emperors, especially when they disliked them, is that they might sort of stereotypically accuse them with certain things. So inappropriate sexual relations would be one of them. Another possibility would be to say that somebody has gone mad. And so, in fact, some of our sources report that supposedly Caligula went mad. Now, I think that it's helpful not to think of this as a psychiatric diagnosis, but instead as a sort of way to say he wasn't behaving in the way that people would have liked to see an emperor behave. Increasingly, Caligula actually, especially after after the death of Drusilla, right here in the middle, he did quite a bit of traveling. And some of those travels included a visit to Alexandria, right here in Egypt. And he supposedly was very invested in the possibility of maybe moving the center of the empire to Alexandria. Again, these may be rumors, but he very much wanted to be sort of engaging with this Eastern tradition. And further, supposedly, his desires led to some conflicts, because at that point, there were a number of Jews living in Alexandria who supposedly would not worship him. And as a ruling emperor outside of Italy, he would have expected that he is essentially treated like a god by subjects outside of, the center of Rome. And so there were some conflicts around that. And we even hear that in the last year of his life, in 40, that he had a fantasy that he wanted to have his statue put into the Jerusalem Temple of the Jews. And so that would have been, of course, a very inappropriate action and led to further riots in Judea. Now, what we find out, though, about sort of more positive action that he has undertaken was that actually through his soldiers, he was able to occupy this territory and turn Mauritania here in Northern Africa into a province. And further, his soldiers crossed over to Britain and were able to, make some contact with, put the potential for occupying Britain and making it into a province as well. So Caligula, in sum, ultimately, though, went down as a bad person in history because quite a few of his actions were seen as very negative by Roman senators, and in addition, also by the Praetorian Guard. And so, in fact, the same Praetorian prefect whom he hired to become the new leader after he got rid of the previous guy, Macro, Cassius Chaerea, was the one who actually ended up killing him soon after he returned from the East in the year 41. So that was a very short rule, all the more legendary for it. But so that was sort of the end of one line of emperors. And with his death, we now sort of essentially ran out of individuals on the Julian side. And so the remaining emperors will all come from the Claudian side of the family. And the person who actually took power when Caligula was killed in 41 was Tiberius Claudius Nero. This is the person who goes by the middle name, right? So the Tiberius Claudius Nero in our shorthand reference. And the legend has it that when Caligula was killed, Claudius supposedly was hiding behind a curtain in the imperial palace, which is where the soldiers found him. And when the Praetorians found him and they offered him that he could become an emperor, he accepted. And he, in fact, was smart enough to promise them money in exchange. Now, what's really fascinating about this story is that Claudius traditionally was not seen as a person who might be capable of becoming an emperor. And the reason for that is that he had some physical defects, and also he was kind of more a scholarly type, not so much a politician type. And so people didn't expect him to become emperor. But in fact, in many ways, sort of all his historical studies and his interest in studying, how Augustus ruled, led him to be, a reasonably reliable, solid administrator. He did base his power on, the support of the Praetorian Guard. And in fact, for the early years of his rule, we get these coins that actually implied that the emperor was received in the Praetorian camp, which was his way of becoming emperor. And people often think that these coins actually were part of the annual payments he made to the soldiers to maintain him in power. In addition, he also sort of justified his tolerance of the soldiers who actually killed his predecessor, was that he issued some other coins that suggested that he was forgiving them. And the keyword that we are starting to see here appear a lot is clemency. And that was his claim, like, I am okay with this arrangement, and I'm happy to rule with even though I kind of became emperor in a very strange way. And so I think it's really helpful to look at a map and sort of think about what's happening when you have a good administrator. And so under Claudius, and again, I recommend you look at the handout here, we find that he, in early years in 43, he invaded Britain, and in fact, we know that these were quite successful invasions. So unlike Caligula, who had very little to say after he invaded it, Claudius was able to invade and then get a triumph for it. In addition, he also was able to make some other territories in the east a province of Rome. And last but not least, he was also able to annex Judea as a sort of allied territory. And what's interesting about all of this is that we see a sort of all over the empire, from west to east, sort of quite a bit of sort of slow but careful and considerate expansion. And we see a sort of plan to fund, essentially with the new provincial taxes, the rule, because it's increasingly more and more expensive to rule the empire. And so maybe two more things that are important to mention about it is that in 47, he was so much able to endorse sort of the traditional message of recovery and healing that Augustus also endorsed, that he was able to celebrate the secular games again, which you recall is sort of this end of a lifespan, a human lifespan. And the idea is that, you know, everything is now just fine in the Roman Empire. And we also know that sort of just in general, the provincial expansion was seen as a huge success. And everywhere in the empire, we have some sort of imagery that celebrates this success. Now, when my students look at sort of a representation of provincial expansion, like this relief from modern day Turkey, what they see there is a figure who's in heroic nude, but has Claudius's facial features, taking a province such as Britain and conquering it. It doesn't look like exactly the guy, you know, who is very friendly and peaceful. It seems quite violent. She seems rather desperate. But I think that the strength implied by such imagery, the provincial expansion, was to stand in for, you know, what Roman power should be about under Claudius, is definitely something that contributed to the positive aspects of his image. Another matter worth mentioning about him is that I already suggested that he was a rather solid administrator. And one problem he encountered with this is that he realized that it was rather dangerous to have Roman senators in leadership positions. They might you know, organize a revolt, or there might be some kind of other problem with them. And so increasingly, he relied on essentially very high-ranking freedmen to run the empire for him. He could trust them. They were his own former slaves. And so he essentially built up an administration with them. Now, here is the problem. Roman senators were very unhappy with this arrangement. So again, we have an emperor who is very much seen by the Roman tradition as not a good emperor, as someone who was not as a very great emperor. Although Augustus eventually goes down as a good emperor, quite a few of these successors did not go down as good emperors. There is one more thing to mention before we conclude this lecture, and that has to do with Claudius's marriages. So he was married 1, 2, we don't even see, 3 and 4 times total. And he had a wife. Wife number 3 was Messalina, with whom he had 2 children, one of them very appropriately named Britannicus after the British conquest. But then he fell in love with Agrippina, who actually, you can see, was a daughter of Germanicus. And, you know, there was a significant message about, you know, reconnecting these 2 sides of the family. And Agrippina already had a child earlier with Domitius Ahenobarbus, but this child, who is going to be the next Emperor Nero, was adopted by Claudius, and so therefore they bear the same name. As it turns out, this was a rather tricky move nevertheless, and as we will find out in the next lesson, in fact, this ended up really bad, and soon Claudius was murdered with the help of Agrippina, and the next emperor was to be this adopted son, Nero.